Well, welcome everybody. It's really exciting to see everybody here. My name's Jane Waite, and I'll be chairing today's seminar. And as always, I'm excited. But anybody who's been to any of the other seminar series knows that that's my normal kind of way of working. This is our seventh in our series on teaching programming with or without AI. And in this series, we've been focusing on new approaches to teaching programming at school. And we explore how research can help us to support learners and, importantly, you often, the teachers, in the teaching and learning of computing. My absolute pleasure to introduce Laurie Gale, who I've known for some time. He's a second-year PhD student at the Raspberry Pi Computing Education Research Centre over in the University of Cambridge. Laurie's research interests, they lie in exploring effective methods for teaching programming to primary and secondary school students. And it's with this hope of helping these students, our pupils, to more enjoy and engage with and achieving computing. And in his talk, Laurie today is going to focus on one of the most challenging aspects of learning to program, and that is fixing bugs. And he, drawing from research, he's going to shed some light on kind of cognitively, so from what's kind of challenging in our minds, and as well as emotionally how people respond, and then the different ways of teaching, the pedagogical factors that can make debugging a difficult task for secondary school students. And which is really brilliant, he's going to offer some practical ideas, some practical strategies that might help people to teach debugging more effectively. So Laurie, thank you again.
So today we're going to be looking at that all-important thing of debugging, the process of finding and fixing errors in a computer program, particularly for students learning their first text-based programming language. That's kind of the scope for today. And so I want us to think about how an 11-year-old or 12-year-old, like a usual student in England, would go about programming, and just try and view this presentation through the lens of maybe a teenager who is learning Python. And imagine that you've written one of your first programs, and you've got some string concatenation going on, and you want to print something to the screen. And then you come to that moment where you press run, and then you get an error. And for some students, they'll be able to solve this error no problem. They would notice that the comma and the quotation mark are in the wrong order. But some students, as I'm sure some of you secondary and university educators might see, would struggle to solve the error. So they might get something printing, but then after that, some students might make a myriad of changes to try and debug their programs. And so it feels weird because I think debugging is something that doesn't need too much rationalizing. We all know it's important, but it still seems to be something that lots of students struggle with. That's what research suggests, and anecdotally from speaking to teachers, it's something that seems to be a problem. But of course, the fact is, in secondary schools nowadays, millions of students will learn to program in a text-based language. This is happening in England, as many of you will know. It's happening in other countries like Poland and Costa Rica and parts of Canada and the US, I believe. And this will mean that loads and loads of students are going to get errors in their programs at such a young age, when this is typically something that's been researched at an undergraduate level. But of course, debugging is absolutely vital if we actually want working and meaningful programs, right? If we want to create cool things, then we need to debug at some point. We can't just avoid it. And as well, we could think of debugging as just like a specific instance of troubleshooting. And troubleshooting is something we do in our everyday lives. We troubleshoot when the printer's not working, or when our car's not starting, etc. And so maybe there's the argument to be made that helping students to debug better in their programs might help them to become better troubleshooters of their daily lives, which would be amazing and makes debugging even more important. But of course, debugging is also a challenge, and we're going to look at some challenges. But first, This is a quote from a famous computer scientist, someone who is an expert in the field and still recognizes that debugging is hard. He says, everyone knows that debugging is twice as hard as writing a program in the first place. So if you're as clever as you can be when you can write it, how will you ever debug it? So this is informally known as Kernighan's Law by a computer scientist named Brian Kernighan, who helped develop the Unix operating system. And we will look at some more of the challenges, but that's just some food for thought. And we'll split this presentation into two mini talks, you could say. We're going to look at two parts of my research on debugging in a text-based language to do with the cognitive challenges, like Jane said, of learning to debug, as well as the emotional or affective challenges, which are not to be ignored either. So if you lose track of one of the mini talks, then you can always come back around in one of the others. But we'll spend quite a lot of time talking about the cognitive challenges just because I find that really, really fascinating, and hopefully you guys will too. But I'm also aware there's other things that make debugging hard, which we don't have time to talk about. For example, this in-class challenges little box. But let's get started with some thinking about why debugging is cognitively challenging. And I think to understand that, we need to understand why programming and learning to program is challenging. So, as we know, there's loads of things we need to think about, or you could say keep in our working memory when we are that 12-year-old student who is learning to program, particularly in a text-based language. So we have to, before even thinking about a programming language, we have to think about what a program's going to do, its design. We have to think about getting correct syntax in a program, which some students really struggle with. We have to make sure that variables are updated and held correctly, as well as all these other things and loads of other things I'm not mentioning. So there's loads to keep track of. And obviously, when you're learning to program, these things are not they're not second nature, right? They're still in your working memory rather than your long-term memory. And on top of this, we might have misconceptions or incorrect conceptions about some of these things we have to hold in our working memory. So here's a common one from Juha Sorva, who's popularized some of the programming misconceptions that novices have. So some students might think that multiple lines of a program can be executed, or some students might think in Python you can kind of like flip the terms in the assignment to either side of the equal sign, the bottom one yielding a syntax error in Python. And then on top of the things we have to keep in our working memory and the misconceptions that students may have, we also have these, at times at least, very annoying error messages. Sometimes these are really not helpful at all. So look at this one, bad input on line 6. That is, for a 12-year-old learning to program, really not useful in terms of indicating what is actually going wrong. And of course, sometimes the error message may have a certain line, and then you need to look above somewhere else in the program to actually solve the error. So there's all these things we have to keep in mind when we are programming. And so when we get an error, which is inevitable if our working memory is really saturated, then we don't have much room to apply effective debugging strategies. And we seem to know some things about how undergraduates go about debugging. But as I've said, millions of people are going to learn to program in a text-based language in their secondary school years. So I think it's important to ask, what are the sort of strategies that lower secondary school students use in their Python programs? And as a result, how can we actually go about improving these, of course, if they need improving? And so this is the kind of question that I wanted to ask about a year ago. And this is a study that I did about a year ago to investigate it. So I'll just briefly explain how we found out the answer to that question, and then I'll show you some results. So first of all, we took 73 lower secondary school students. And when I say lower secondary school, in this case, I'm talking 12 to 14-year-old students learning Python. And then in their lessons, so they had an hour computing lesson, they have an hour computing lesson every week. In one of them, I gave them some debugging exercises. And you could say I was kind of nasty to the students because I gave students some deliberately bugged code. I had written some sabotaged programs, you could say. And these debugging exercises consisted of a description of what the program is meant to do. As you can see here, hopefully, if it's not too small, the text, I also told students how many errors were in the program to kind of give them a bit of direction so that they may feel accomplished if they solved all of them. And then I gave students a buggy program, which had a number of errors in, which were kind of common errors that have been found to have been made before by students. And then I gave them a code editor. So they didn't just like highlight the errors, they actually had to go at solving the errors in the program. And then every time a student pressed run, that state of their program when they pressed run was stored, as well as if there was an error message, what that was, and the time at which they pressed run, generating lots of data that we'll get into. But we're going to look at this programming or debugging exercise a little bit more. So it's important to understand the context. So this is a little program that checks if someone should apply to be a computing teacher based on if they're 21 or over and they have a passion for computing. And if both of those things are true, then the program should output result of check successful and otherwise should print unsuccessful. And the highlighted yellow bits are where there's errors. So first of all, there's a syntax error with this equality operator, or sorry, assignment operator in the condition of the if statement, which should be a double equals. And then this or should be an and, because of course, people need to be 21 or over and have a passion for computing. And then this greater than sign should be a greater than or equals. And then line 10 should either be unindented or we should copy and paste a statement and put it in the other if block of the if statement. So as I said, I recorded every time students pressed run and then stored it and spent lots and lots of time kind of retracing students' steps in the debugging exercises to understand run by run what are students changing, and hence to an extent how are they trying to debug. And for the 73 students there were like almost 350 debugging exercises attempted and then over 7,000 runs, and there's other data sets with lots more runs than this, but I spent lots of time looking at these manually. And then there's some good news, I guess. So out of those exercise attempts, almost half were successfully completed, so all the errors were removed. That's great. But unfortunately, there were over a third of the students who didn't successfully complete any. And we're going to look at some students' actual debugging behaviors in a second. But to summarize, in a few words, there was a very wide range of debugging behaviors on display. And to kind of summarize what these behaviors were, when I looked at less successful exercise attempts or students' debugging behaviors, students often added errors and used this process of trial and error, which I'm sure if you're a secondary educator or just a teacher, you may have seen such debugging strategies. But I think to an extent, trial and error isn't always the best strategy. Sometimes it can be useful, but we found that students would sometimes make a change, press run, and then not revert if that change wasn't correct. And so you get this kind of accumulation of additional errors that students have added. And so it becomes even more difficult to debug than when you first got an error. And then there was lots of this spam run behavior, which I'll talk about in a minute a bit more. But then more successful students seem to make less changes with kind of more accuracy or intentionality. And they often got their code running, by which I mean like successfully executing or running without an error message being thrown quicker. And they often didn't run their code as many times either. And so to exemplify some of these behaviors, let's actually look at two students who had a go at the debugging exercises. So we have Alicia here and Gabrielle, not their actual names, but let's just go with them. And as I mentioned earlier, or I forgot to mention, students conducted or completed a survey after they had to go the debugging exercises. And one of the questions I asked was, how do you feel you performed on the exercises out of 5? So Alicia thought she performed all right. She thought she performed okay, 3 out of 5. And then Gabrielle thought he performed well. And now I'm just going to get another window up. So let's have a look at Gabrielle's changes. Actually, let's start with Alicia. So this is just a little tool that I've been using to kind of visualize students' changes they've been making on their debugging exercises. So you can see the state of the students' programs, and you can see like the time between their runs, the error message students are receiving, and how long they've taken on the exercise. And then you can see the differences that students have made to their programs every time they press run. So hopefully that's clear, but we'll go through the changes slowly. So this is Alicia's attempt at exercise 3. If you recall, there's 4 errors. There's an error here. This should be an and. This should be a greater than or equals, and this should be unindented. And Alicia spent 12 and a half minutes having a go at solving this error, which I think is amazing. That's great perseverance, first of all. And the first time she's pressed run is 22 seconds into the exercise. And if we compare her first run or the code in her first run to the original state of the program, they're the same. So Alicia spent 22 minutes, presumably, although I can't say for certain, like reading the exercise description, maybe having a look at the program. But I'm not exactly sure if this is enough time to properly take in what the program is doing, particularly as it's written by me, not Alicia. But let's keep moving to see what happens. The first change Alicia makes seems to be based on the error message, because the original error message says bad input on line 6. And Alicia's first change, you may have been able to see, it's very subtle. She just adds a colon. You can see that. And in doing so, you could kind of say that this adds another syntax error to the program, because a colon can't go there in Python. There has to be a condition before the colon. And so she's already added one error to her program. And then 5 seconds later, she adds some white space that shouldn't really be there. And then after that, now a minute and a half after that run, she's like reverted back to the original state of the program. So that's 2.5 minutes where Alicia's kind of not made any corrective changes. But then if we look through the changes a bit quicker, hopefully you can see that Alicia's making very subtle changes, as you can see. She's like slightly indented a line. She's changed the inequality to be logically incorrect. She's changed this input to a print and an input. So most of her changes are small and they're not corrective. They either like don't add an error or they add some syntax or logical error. And this kind of repeats throughout the process. Alicia unfortunately gets really close to solving one of the logical errors, but the two symbols are the wrong way round. And unfortunately, this error persists for the rest of the program, or she just kind of undoes it. Another interesting thing about Alicia's debugging behavior is this spam run thing that I mentioned earlier. And this is very common in students who are struggling. So if you can see the time between this run and her previous run, so the 18th and 17th run, there's less than a second between the runs, and she hasn't changed anything. And if we kind of go through these and notice the time between the runs, this indicates a behavior of like not changing anything, but repeatedly pressing run. And I kind of hypothesize that this either indicates emotional disengagement with the task. So Alicia's kind of got a bit tired of debugging, particularly if she's 10 minutes into the exercise now, or maybe a feeling of desperation or emotional angst because the program is not doing what it's meant to. And Alicia, every time she presses run, is getting the same error message, which must be infuriating. And then she starts adding things like plain English that aren't going to solve the errors in this program. And so if we skip to the end, we could spend all day looking at students debugging behaviors. But if we skip to the end, we can see Alicia's ended the program with more errors than she actually began with. So this is close to solving a logical error, but it hasn't quite. This has added a logical error, this little comma, as well as all the other errors in the program not being solved. So later on in the discussion, I'd be interested to hear if this is something you guys have seen in your teaching. But this was very common among students. That's kind of one point I want to make. So just to show that this isn't specific to Alicia's debugging behavior, let's look at how representative this is. So as I mentioned, first of all, Alicia ran the program before making any changes. 95% of students did this out of the 73 at some point on one of the exercises. And the median time to press run for the first time, if students didn't make any changes, was 17 seconds. And again, I'm not sure that's enough time for students to understand the programming description and then read the program and properly comprehend what it's doing, which is really important if you're giving students code that isn't theirs. But of course, you could say maybe they just wanted to see the error message and then work off that. And Alicia kind of did this because she made changes to the line that the error message was pointing to, which is the same for all but two of the students in the study. But even though Alicia made somewhat kind of like pinpointed changes, you could say, or localized changes, she added several syntax errors. And unfortunately, 86% of students did this. So it's very common. And again, you could say, well, adding syntax errors is kind of normal when you're debugging. Like I certainly add errors when I'm debugging, but at least I'm able to revert them and know that they are erroneous changes after some feedback. As we saw, Alicia struggled to understand that these changes she were making weren't correct. And then we saw this spam run behavior where she was running the program really quickly and repetitively, maybe indicating emotional angst or disengagement. Three-quarters of students did this at some point. There were so many runs which were like completely identical with a really small time between them. And the median time between these runs was like less than half a second. So hopefully that demonstrates that lots of students were pressing run very, very quickly. And then Alicia ended the program, like I said, with more errors than she started with. And unfortunately, every time she pressed run, she had an error. And it was basically the same error message every time. And this was the same for like a third of the exercise attempts. So that's one end of the stick. Let's look at Gabrielle quickly, and we'll use the same tool. This won't take us long because Gabrielle only spent 2.5 minutes on the exercise, and he got his program running in less than 30 seconds. And the way he did this is by replacing that equals for double equals, which hopefully you can see here. These are very kind of small changes that students are making. So Gabrielle has his program running. Great. Then what does he do next? Well, he seemingly tests his program because he hasn't changed it. But then after that, he adds this print statement on line 8. And like I said, that kind of resolves one of the logical errors because now we're printing the result of this computing teacher check, even when the condition is met. And then if we pass through the runs a bit more, Gabrielle has replaced the or with an and 21 seconds later, which resolves one of the logical errors. So he's only got one error left, which he then, a few seconds later, has a go at solving and then does the same thing Alicia did. She got the symbols just the wrong way round. So this should be greater than or equals, not equals or greater than. But unlike Alicia, even though he added a syntax error, he's able to resolve it 10 seconds later. And then he runs his program a couple more times. And then there we go. He solved it. He successfully completed it and he can move on. So I think it's interesting to see and really think about like what are the differences between these students' behaviors, and then as a result, how can we make maybe what's stopping more students from debugging like Gabrielle, and why are students debugging like Alicia, I suppose. First of all, they both run their programs fairly early on, but the difference was Gabrielle actually made a corrective change and Alicia didn't. And then Alicia seemed to use the error message for some sort of guidance, but wasn't able to properly localize the error. Gabrielle looked like he was doing this iterative testing thing, right? Like he was running the program, making a small change and repeating and resolving logical errors as he went. Gabrielle made lots of corrective changes. Alicia, unfortunately, didn't make any. Instead, Alicia added several syntax errors, as we saw lots of. But when Gabrielle added a syntax error, he was able to resolve it within 10 seconds. And then, of course, as we just saw, Gabrielle ended in the correct state. He resolved all the errors. Alicia ended with more errors than she started with. So again, what's stopping more students debugging like Gabrielle? What are some barriers to successful debugging behaviors? Well, here's some thoughts, and I think there's many. But the first one that comes to mind is knowledge of Python syntax. So we saw Alicia making these changes that were like kind of localized, but adding errors because she was adding things that are valid in the language, like a colon, but just in the wrong place, whereas Gabrielle was able within 30 seconds to spot a syntax error. So I think that's one really important thing. And you could argue that like solving syntax errors isn't really debugging, which we'll come to in a bit. I think also the time taken to get the program successfully executing is a barrier, because Alicia was getting the same error message every time she pressed run. So if she made an erroneous change, there wasn't really any feedback from the error message telling her that her change was incorrect. But when Gabriel had his program successfully executing and then made a syntax error, it was quite obvious his change caused that syntax error, if that makes sense. And as a result, he can then go and undo it, or have a go at making a fix to the change he made. That's just not possible with Alicia if the error message is staying the same, which is another barrier, I think, to stopping students debugging successfully. The error messages are sometimes just not easy to understand for students, especially if they have technical speak that's not very specific. And of course, there may be some, well, I'm sure there are some effective factors at play, which we'll talk about in a little bit, such as students' motivations or their like mindset towards errors. I'm not saying this applies to Alicia. She spent so long in the exercise, so I think she has great resilience. But some students might not be motivated, which is where maybe we get that spam run behavior. Now, for some suggestions, that might have been a lot to take in, but how can all of this finding stuff about ineffective debugging behavior actually help with its teaching in schools? Well, a few suggestions. Like I said, some people might not even think that syntax errors are useful for debugging. So why don't we just make them not possible to make? So one example of doing this is a concept called frame-based editing, which some of you may have heard of. And this is an amazing website or tool called Stripe, made by Michael Curling and Neil Brown and his team at King's College London. And this is programming with frames rather than like a open sandbox text editor. And it's bridging the gap, they say, between block-based and text-based programming. Because as you can see in this recording, I'm still programming in Python, but I just can't make some of the syntactically incorrect changes that, say, Alicia was making. So I can't change this, like this arrow, which is an assignment. So I can't add extra equals. I can't add an open bracket without adding a closed one. I can't indent lines that shouldn't be indented. I can't miss out a colon on an if statement, etc., etc. So this is a great way of getting your students focusing on actual logical errors or runtime errors rather than those little syntax ones that can be so distracting. So if you're a teacher and you haven't seen this, go and try it out. It's not quite 1.0 yet. I think it's in beta, but I think they plan to release a proper version soon. But by all means, have a go at playing with it. Another thing that can help, more explainable error messages. And this very much relates to last month's seminar that Veronica so brilliantly gave, where instead of, or in addition to displaying a programming error message, get a large language model to explain it in more detail. And you can prompt engineer so that the model doesn't just give like a solution like it was in Veronica's study, but you can get the LLM to generate more explainable error messages with hints or explaining what the terms in the error message mean. And this is something that I'm not sure there's like open, readily available tooling for yet, but it's certainly something you can just tell your students. Just plug the error messages into ChatGPT or maybe just Google them. And that will help with their explainability. As well as that, I think teaching effective debugging strategies is really important in addition to these other things. So we'll look at a couple of these. Maybe we need to discourage ineffective debugging strategies as well. I'm not sure that's a good idea or not. But research in debugging education has been going on for ages. So this is a paper from 1987 with a systematic debugging process, i.e. just a set of questions modeling how students can find and fix an error in their programs. So this is fairly easy, right? You can ask these questions to students, and I'm sure some of you already do. But even better, you can try and get students to ask these questions to themselves so that they don't have to be reliant on teachers' help when they get an error. So this is one by Sharon Carver, and there's a reference for this in the slides if you'd like to go and have a look afterwards. And then there's another systematic debugging process that's based on error types, which was developed by someone called Tilman McKaylee in 2019. building on the previous process. So these are things I guess you could like have as posters in your classroom. And this isn't just secondary school specific, right? If you're like a university educator or a primary educator, you might not be able to get syntax errors in Scratch, but students can certainly ask these questions to themselves to do with logical errors. Right, so we have talked about the cognitive challenges of debugging for quite a while, but I also would like to briefly touch on for the next few minutes the affective challenges of debugging. Because imagine being Alicia and spending 12 minutes on an exercise and getting an error every time you press run. I don't believe that that is without consequence. That's going to probably annoy students. And research has found this to be the case. So there's been several studies on how students feel when they are programming. And even though these studies are focused on programming, encountering errors is always something that comes up as like a source of fury. Of course, it can be satisfying for some students who are maybe confident programmers or enjoy the challenge. But lots of students talk about this being hit by lightning experience when they encounter an error they're not really expecting, making them feel dazed or overwhelmed or annoyed. That same study talks about how students feel angry or maybe desperate, like a sense of, oh no, not another error. Perhaps Alicia was feeling like that when she was debugging. And this is a student quote talking about how they feel kind of disappointed when they're hitting run and then maybe their programs doesn't run as they expect them to, it being a confidence roller coaster. And I think the really important thing I'd like to stress is that if these emotional and cognitive challenges are the main part of a student's initial experiences with programming, we can't expect them to go on and form positive attitudes all of the time. We know that initial experiences of learning something inform one's attitude to that subject and like their confidence in the subject. So it's really important that these emotional and I guess cognitive challenges are accounted for so students don't have loads of unsuccessful experiences, which they then might make them think they're bad at debugging because of. And this is reflected in another paper. So this is a student who seems to have low confidence because every time they run the code for the first time, they expect it to fail. And of course, you could argue that maybe they've got like a positive error mindset because they don't want to get their hopes up too much when they are debugging. But I'm not always sure if this is the case. I think in the wider context of the paper, sounds like someone who's not had good experiences with programming and definitely debugging. And all of those quotes come from undergraduate papers where learners are 18 plus and they have chosen to program all day long and they get to program for hours on end. What about lower secondary school students who are in their teenage years and only have an hour of programming a week? What are their attitudes and emotions towards debugging? Well, this was another part of the study that I've just talked about that I wanted to seek. So, as I forgot to mention earlier, after students completed those debugging exercises, they did a little survey. And that survey asked students about some attitudes they have towards debugging, the emotions they feel when they're debugging. And here's some of them. So their self-efficacy in debugging, how confidently do they feel they can successfully resolve errors? How anxious do they feel when they are debugging? How frustrated do they feel? As well as how useful do they think debugging is as a skill for daily life? And so students answered a couple of questions on these each using like a Likert scale. And we looked at which attitudes significantly correlated based on these responses. And there were lots of them. And the point I want to get across here isn't like a particular correlation between a certain pair of attitudes or emotions, although it is kind of interesting, but also sad that girls tended to report lower levels of debugging self-efficacy. So they felt that they were less able to successfully debug. But I think what this hopefully shows, if it's not too confusing, is that these attitudes are significantly related, particularly self-efficacy by the looks of it. They're very interlinked. So if a student has initial unsuccessful experiences when they are solving an error, then their confidence may be low in the process of debugging. But then according to this research, not necessarily by causation, but by association, students may feel with their lower confidence, may feel anxious when they're debugging, may not think debugging is a useful skill, and by proxy may feel that they get quite frustrated when they're solving errors. And maybe this is nothing new. Maybe we all know that attitudes and emotions are interlinked. But I think it's still important to highlight, and for us when we are teaching programming, to be aware of the emotional consequences that those first experiences have. As another part of my research, I've been interviewing and speaking to some amazing teachers to ask about their experiences with debugging. And here's some suggestions from them, not me, as to how to like improve effect for students just starting out with solving errors. One thing that lots of students mentioned is enforcing a positive error culture and getting across that errors are completely normal. In fact, one study I've read said when they interviewed professional software developers, out of the time they spent programming, about half of it was spent debugging. So that's fine if half of your time is spent debugging in the classroom. And another way we can enforce a positive error culture is by like measures of normalizing errors. So some teachers get their students to break their partner's code and then have a go at solving it. So perhaps gamifying the process. Or I found this cool research paper called Stump the Teacher, where students all have a go at writing buggy programs that the teacher then has to debug in front of everyone. And so if a teacher struggles to solve some of the errors that students have given, I hopefully think that models that some errors are difficult to solve and that's okay. And then some of their students can help. And also, if students do struggle to debug, celebrate the effort as well as the outcome. So celebrate Alicia spending like 12.5 minutes trying to debug errors. Even if she wasn't able to do so, that perseverance should be rewarded. But like I said, I think according to some theories, such as self-efficacy theory, the extent to which a student succeeds with learning a skill such as programming early on is a major determinant of their attitudes they go on to form about that subject. So it's really important to give students chances to solve errors successfully early on. And so if you are programming in Python and students have a huge scope for errors, they might have errors they're just not able to solve because of the aforementioned challenges. But one thing you could have a go at is giving students debugging exercises which maybe have one very simple error that students can try and solve with their friends, and then work your way up from there and giving them more difficult errors so that students are prepared when they come across errors in their own programs in the wild, but also have a go or have the chance to successfully solve errors. And this is a quote I just love from one of the teachers I was speaking to. This teacher wants to see spectacular failures when programming. If something should have gone right and went badly wrong, but somebody found something interesting along the way, celebrate it. And that is exactly the embodiment of enforcing a positive error culture, taking the fear out of getting errors. Again, I'm sure some of you guys do this very, very well, but this is just what my research has found so far. So to just recap what we've been speaking about, debugging is a very powerful skill. We absolutely need it when we're programming, and maybe it's useful for our daily lives when we are solving problems, but it's also incredibly challenging to learn at times. And because there's so much to store in our working memories when we are programming, when we come across errors, some students might resort to debugging strategies that move them away from the goal state of a working program rather than towards it. And of course, these experiences have emotional consequences, and it's important to realize that these attitudes and emotions students are feeling are very interlinked when they're debugging. But hopefully I've highlighted some tools and resources and pedagogies that research has found to be helpful. So there's plenty that can be done to help. So with that, I just wanted to thank you so much for listening. I hope you found this interesting, and I'm really, really looking forward to hearing your discussion and questions.
Thank you so much, Laurie. I think what's brilliant is to hear everybody's ideas, and this is clearly something that all teachers are having issues with. We're taking a bit of a break over the summer. We always break in August, but we're actually having a break in September because there's so many different conferences going on. So we're back on Tuesday, the 8th of October. And we have Arto Hellas and Juho Leonen from Aalto University in Finland, and they're going to be talking about using AI in order to help teach programming. So that's going to be really exciting in terms of the use of generative AI models to help in teaching of programming. So look out on the website for that next one. And thank you again. And can we just do a big clap again, Laurie?